Hello and welcome to another podcast episode. This podcast episode was previously recorded for another podcast, but since we couldn't put it up on there, we decided to release it all by itself. So I hope you enjoy the show. Today our guest is Paul Biggar, the creator of Dark or Darklang, however you want to call it. Why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm CTO, CEO, something of Darklang, which is an attempt to make building backend software easier. So we do everything integrated, the platform, the editor, the programming language, all of it, and it allows you to do things way easier, differently. And yeah, that's what I'm working on.
Okay. Yeah, it's quite exciting. I remember when, first of all, when it kind of came out, there were a lot of people talking about this in the developer communities, at least around me. Mm-hmm. And it was kind of exciting. It was like, wow, zero downtime deployments and lots of stuff. And I wasn't really quite sure what to even make of it. What is this thing? And I have to admit, as somebody who, every developer likes their own programming languages, right? And so when I saw, I have to write in this other language, I was let down quite a bit. I was like, this is not fun. Because I had a feeling it was an infrastructure thing. But actually, it's so much more, right? So can you talk more about what the whole entire system is?
Yes, the premise of Dark is what if we list out literally everything that we think is wrong with software and try to invent something that doesn't have these problems? So, obvious ones are infrastructure, but maybe a less obvious one is to have not just zero downtime deploy, but 0 second deploy. So if, you think of a CI/CD pipeline process as, something that wastes your time, that gets between you and your customer, then surely the best version of that is 0 seconds. And so those kind of are the two big ones. The what if you didn't have to think about infrastructure at all? What if you didn't have to think about deployment at all? And so what you've got is kind of this language or platform or infrastructure or something where you are literally writing Dark live in production. And then of course you need to make that safe, and you need to make it so that you don't have things like syntax errors that are ruining your experience for you. And so we really had to build the whole thing together, including custom language. And the reason for the custom language isn't just, I like building programming languages, although maybe there's a tiny bit of that in there. But it's also the semantics of any existing language. We're here to talk about Rust. Rust has a compiler which, is kind of slow. But even if it was very fast, it doesn't match the semantics of a language where when I press a keystroke, I want it to be in production. So that we kind of had to start from scratch to solve that use case.
Yeah. That's a big endeavor, right? Because you're building infrastructure that has to be able to accept fast deployments and kind of be fault tolerant, I think. Mm-hmm. You have to accept, there's the routing, there's the security, there's the language, the parsing. You guys must have had a giant team, right? When you were working on this.
Well, you would think so. At one point, we were at about 8 people. We had up to about 10 people at one point. But honestly, writing the editor was the biggest challenge. Because, writing a language, you can write an interpreter in 500 lines. Standard library, once it's written, it's written. And infrastructure definitely was work. But making a text editor / IDE that has all of this custom tracing, live value capability was actually it's where we spent the majority of our time.
Oh, the editor itself, you're saying?
Yeah.
I know that's also a huge thing.
Yeah, I know, right?
What was the initial idea actually to start up this whole entire thing? Was it just a piece of it and it just kind of got bigger, or was actually what you guys are building today was actually what the main idea was?
What we decided to build was what is the smallest version of this that we can build? And so we decided that it would be backend only. So as opposed to, building, desktop apps and mobile apps. And I think we could extend the idea, if you're building web apps, then you're probably building JavaScript and you're building mobile apps and that sort of thing. And maybe Dark could extend there, but we were no, absolutely not. That we need to cut it off somewhere. And so the HTTP boundary is where we decided to cut it off. So it was actually smaller than the original idea, but I don't think we could have gone significantly smaller again.
What's actually, so wait, who is this actually targeting? Because I feel like when I see the videos that it's kind of targeting people who want to build something but don't necessarily know how to program. I don't know, that's the feeling I have when I see it, because it's very intuitive, easy to use the editor.
Yeah, it is intuitive and easy to use. It's designed for software engineers. And we're sort of stepping away we're trying to separate ourselves a little bit from the no code, low code kind of part of the world. Because I think those people are building sort of like wizards for people who don't know how to code. We're building a functional language, and one that speaks HTTP, has functions and iterators and mapping across collections and that sort of thing. It's very much designed for programmers from the very start. As you say, it's easy to use, as all things should be. One could argue that Rust is a very easy to use language, certainly compared, when you look at Cargo and you compare, the package managed situation or the tooling situation to C or C++. I think it's a good thing that it's easier to use, I guess is what I'm saying.
I don't know if you can argue that Rust is an easy language. I mean, that borrow checker is infamous, right?
For sure, but Cargo the UX is fucking excellent.
I believe that was because the team who made Cargo was the same team that made Bundler for Ruby. So I think they took their knowledge and then found what was bad, what was good, and then kind of extended it.
Right. I'm a firm believer in the more you integrate stuff, the fewer intersection points there are, and all the complexity lives in the intersection points.
Okay. Maybe we can kind of go back a little bit about, who are you? Like,
yeah.
How can make and work on something like this, and what makes you kind of qualify for this? Like, how did you even get started programming?
Let me see. I think my parents sent me to computer summer camp when I was like, 8. So that was either the 80s or the 90s, somewhere around there. But I didn't really start programming until I went to college. I did undergrad in CS, and that was where I really got started. And it wasn't like part of my university, and partly the people that I hung around with, we did all the programming languages. By the time I finished college, I probably knew like 6 or 7 programming languages. We're writing in Perl and Eiffel and, obviously C and C++ and all that. So I think I got into programming languages kind of early in my career, and then I did a PhD in compilers and static analysis. So furthering my sort of interest in programming languages.
Okay, a PhD in that. Like, what kind of specific study did you do within compilers? Because I think when you do a PhD, you have to very much a specific thing, right?
Yeah. So the title of my dissertation was the design and implementation of an ahead-of-time compiler for PHP. And basically, I had designed what at the time was the most advanced static analysis engine for PHP. And in particular, it took into account the way that PHP is just like completely dynamic, and was able to model that if it was possible, if programs were actually, if that was barring people doing crazy shit, it was able to actually like model, and give you sort of conservative of types and that sort of thing in a way that probably nothing has really done since. Even the Facebook stuff, it took a different approach.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, is this like the granddaddy of the PHP hack? Was there any kind of things taken from that?
It was happening at around the same time. So they started that in the late 2000s, which was around the same time I was doing my PhD. I gave a presentation at Facebook before the thing came out, but I'd heard that there was some discussion to use it, but I think it wasn't really designed for the Facebook use case. I think it would have been like inappropriate for Facebook. Facebook had the ability to like apply some constraints, and my thing was designed for the world of no constraints. Like, how can we model programs that people actually write? I think that it would have been a poor choice to actually use it. I mean, even apart from the fact that it was PhD research quality.
I'm not too sure exactly what that means. Does that mean it's good or bad, or does it mean like, well, theoretically it's good, but no idea if it's any how good
research
it is?
Has the reputation of producing things that aren't really usable in the real world. And I think it was actually like very good for academic level stuff. Certainly for PhD dissertation level stuff. Like it had a full like auto tool suite built on different things. I think it was quite good. But at the same time, even analyzing trivial programs took like 8 gigs of memory.
Yeah, I was going to say, actually, now I remember what you're talking about. Like, I know I work a lot with Elixir, and I do remember people talking about in Erlang, like a lot of the academics are looking at Erlang and saying, okay, we made this language Haskell, but nobody is really using it in real world in comparison. Like, why is Erlang so good? Like, let's see, what's the difference, Why is it that this one is more useful? So I understand what you're saying. And like, there's a lot of times where like the commercial world take a look at it, see what's the latest research in academia, try it and say, no, this one doesn't work. We got to maybe make a tweak.
Yeah, so I think programming languages is like one of the only areas where industry does like cool research. Well, it's not the only place where it does cool research, but like an awful lot of the research happens in industry. I suppose distributed systems is kind of the same.
Okay. And so, so you graduated, you worked on this PHP stack analyzer, but what was your first job out of school, basically?
My first job out of school, after my undergrad, I worked at a games company. So we're writing C++ in video games, and didn't last very long there. So I went back and did the PhD. After the PhD, I did a Y Combinator startup very briefly. That was less than a year, failed hard. And then I went to work at Mozilla. So I was a compiler engineer at Mozilla. I was working on the JavaScript JIT, on garbage collection, on various different parts of the Mozilla, the Firefox stack. And then I was there for about a year. And then I started up CircleCI. So I was the CEO, one of the two founders of CircleCI, and stayed about 4 years until it was about 30, 35 people.
Okay, why did you leave? I mean, I know I've used CircleCI once before and I was just okay with it, but it seems like nowadays, like everybody has a CI service.
Yeah. So, I mean, Circle does well as far as I can tell. I left because being the CEO of a 35-person company sucks. And it sucks especially if you do it badly, which I was certainly doing. And I looked at, there's quite a body of knowledge on what it takes to be a good CEO of a company of like 35 people or of 1,000 people, which is about how big Circle is now. And I was just like, I was looking at it, I was like, this looks like a shit job. I do not want this job. And we're very fortunate to have acquired someone who, like the company that we acquired, they actually took over the management and they are still the CEO and CTO today, Jim Rose and Rob Zuber, and doing a phenomenal job at it as well. And I remember the first couple of years I was thinking like, oh my God, please don't quit. I do not want to be, asked to come and do this again.
Well, I appreciate you kind of knowing what you do and don't want to do. And it's, especially if you start up a company and then you think it's not good for you. I think that's very, how do you say that? Kind of ballsy, I guess I would say, because it's hard for me to like, I started this thing and then like, I think it's time for me to leave, right? It's not made for me.
Right.
It's hard.
Well, years of therapy helped, so.
Okay. I'm happy that, you found a method for that. Okay, so after CircleCI, were you just kind of relaxing for a bit because, it was a little bit stressful for a while?
Oh my God.
Or were you just hungry to start the next thing?
I was so burnt out. At the same time, I was hungry to start the next thing, but like I tried to start like 2 companies and I was not ready. And it really took about 18 months for me to get to a point where I was capable of doing something else again.
Wow, I'm sorry. Bad experience for you.
Well, it's a fun story now.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
All of our traumas get turned into lovely little narratives.
Yeah, I heard a phrase once, like life is like picture, the negative, it takes a negative to develop, right?
Mm-hmm.
So another way to say it. Okay, so you took 18 months off. Like, how did you kind of cool off in between CircleCI and what you're in Dark?
I did like a couple of the standard things. I went surfing in Costa Rica for a couple of months. I did a road trip around the US. And then I moved to New York, which is actually where I live now. But I did Recurse Center, which is sort of a programming retreat kind of thing. And I really loved that. That was really nice. Wrote a bunch of Haskell there, learned some AI. Really kind of nice environment of like self-directed learning. Highly recommend it.
Okay. I don't know, kind of funny that you're like, well, I did standard stuff. Well, surfing Costa Rica is not really standard to me.
It's like when you talk to like other founders who also burnt out and, just worked, 100 hours a week for like 4 or 8 years or whatever it is. And then everyone has like very similar experiences of burnout and of like needing to handle it. And some of them, go to an ashram or do a 10-day, silent meditation or, geek out on Burning Man or whatever. So I think I took a relatively low-key variation.
Yeah, I always hear about Burning Man.
Right.
I don't know what to think about it. It sounds like a weird cult and lots of weird stuff happening, but I don't know what's the truth about that one.
Yeah, I haven't been myself, so the less I comment on that, probably the better.
All right. So at some point, obviously, you felt, okay, you know what? I need to do something. Or what was kind of the thought when you were kind of ready? How did you know when you were ready to start something?
Well, I had planned out how much savings I had. So, at some point I was going to be out of cash and need a job. And that was sort of 18 months. And then with 6 months to go, I started actually thinking about what I wanted to do next. And a lot of a couple of them were startup ideas, but I really wanted to be off the VC track. I didn't like the thing of like taking venture capital and just like, when you take VC, you just have to grow. Every year you have to grow. No matter what you did last year, it doesn't matter. It's what you do this year. And there was just a lot of stress with that. And so I wanted to do something that wasn't that. I wanted to do a 1-person startup or a 5-person startup or, something pretty small. And so I had all these ideas and I was trying to match them against it. And then when I looked at like, what is the tech actually going to be like to build this? Like, how are we going to be able to build this technology in a way that like 5 people can build this and maintain it and so on? And I really didn't have a good answer for that. And I kept thinking about that problem. And then I kept thinking about that problem so much that I talked myself into doing Dark, even though it was sort of the opposite of what I wanted to do.
You talked yourself into doing something that's the opposite of what you wanted to do?
Yeah, I talked myself into doing something that solved that problem of like how someone like me who wanted to do a small startup could build it and have the hosting managed and the infrastructure managed, and not think about that, just think about the business problem and the customers and that sort of thing. And so I ended up solving that problem, making a startup to solve that problem instead of the actual things that I had thought about, which I'm sure were dumb. And I don't remember what they were, so they couldn't have been that good. But that is how I talked myself into doing Dark.
That sounds like yak shaving, right? Where it's like you have another problem, but then you solve the first one and you're stuck on the first one forever.
Right. Soon I will be able to make, the clever consumer app that I was thinking of in 2015.
Yeah, but I mean, with the kind of big churn you're making in Dark, I don't know if that'll ever happen. Maybe you're going to have a V3 before that even comes.
Yeah, that's certainly creating a lot of work for myself.
So it's okay, after this rewrite, then we'll be fine. I can go back to Costa Rica for,
Oh my God, I might need it. The next rewrite is the front end, right?
I haven't been catching up on the news about Dark, but I know rewrites take a while, so I can't imagine there was stuff that changed. I think your rewrite, maybe actually, you know what, before we're kind of like talking about stuff that I think the audience may not know, right?
Yeah.
So maybe let's talk a little bit more, like, because you had some pretty big changes. And I think that's good to talk about because a lot of people are saying, oh, startup life, that's very exciting.
I mean,
yeah,
exciting
exactly.
It certainly is exciting.
It could be exciting in 2 different extremes, right?
Yeah, so basically we ran out of cash, so we raised 3.5 million, and then we, had a team of 8 people, and we spent that and we went to raise 10 million, and people didn't want to give it to us. And the startup ecosystem wasn't quite as frothy as it is now, but we raised with a story of, this is going to be the next big cloud. It's going to change everything. We are the next AWS or the next Stripe or something like that. People are like, okay, yeah, great. We believe you. So, how many users do you have? And the answer was not very many, and it wasn't growing either. And so we weren't actually able to raise 10 million. We were instead able to get 2 million from insiders and some new investors. And we were spending 150K a month. And so it was like, oh shit, we have reasonably a year left on this thing, and what are we going to do? And we came to the conclusion that there wasn't a strategy available, and then of course COVID happened, and so we're sort of at that point of like, well, the industry might be dead in 6 months. Our ability to fundraise in a year is probably dead. What are we going to do? And so we came with the decision basically to reduce the company to just me, and spent a couple of months, gave everyone good severance, spent a couple of months getting everyone jobs. Fortunately, everyone had jobs before the severance ran out, so that was good. But then mid to late 2020, and it's just me building Dark.
Now, this is another question. Why is it only you in terms of like, of course I understand about the cash flow, but why is it you? Is it because it's kind of like your baby, you feel obligated to it, or you still believe in it, or kind of curious about that part?
Yes, I believe in it, very much believe in it. And I definitely had, this sort of like, should I step away from this thing? I just went through a very stressful time. But, kind of like, do I step away from this? Is this a time to like shut it down, open source it, something like that? But no, I really believed in it, and I really didn't have anything better to do. Like, there wasn't something else in the world that I wanted to do, and this is a thing that I want to do. It's also a thing I really like doing. I like coding. I kind of like recognize that I could, do quite a lot of other things. But it's like, this is like, if I had another job, I'd probably want a side project, and it would probably be something like Dark. So I'm very happy where I am, very happy building this.
Much less stressful having to manage people. I think it's probably so hard to manage yourself, no?
I spent a lot of 2021 learning how to manage myself. Tried all sorts of different ways of like, productivity hacks and project management and that sort of thing. It took quite a while actually to get it to the point where it could be like productive on a day-to-day basis without that sort of external push to get things done. But yeah, I think I managed it. At the moment, I'm doing pretty solidly on that front.
Yeah, because when you got nobody who's like saying, hey, I need this thing, it's like, well, I can relax in bed. I can,
Right.
Especially COVID, right? Where you going to go?
Well, to a certain extent, it was, I would get up and I would sit at the computer every day, and then I would do, I just wouldn't accomplish very much, even though I was sitting here. And the thing that worked for me is starting to do stuff in public. So now, every day I tweet what I'm working on that day. There's a public project manager. I put everything public. The Dark code base is public. You can see all the pull requests I make. Our infrastructure is public. Everything is as public as it can be. And that was the movement that let me be able to project manage myself better.
Is it something like you put it out there so then you think you have to kind of live up to that standard? Or I'm just kind of curious about what's the mindset?
It's more that by trying to make it readable for other people, I make it readable for myself. So it's like if we're using GitHub project boards to organize, in what order we do things. And it's like, if these two columns are readable to somebody else, then they make sense. And if they make sense, then they're readable to someone else. And whenever I found that something was just unclear or someone wouldn't be able to understand, it usually meant that I didn't understand. And then, so, kind of organize the project, do the same thing for the documentation. We have a Slack community where I try to publish what I'm doing and what I'm working on as well and try to be open with it. And all those things just instill discipline, I guess, really.
Now, let's take a quick step back. You do use the word we a lot, but you just said that the only one in the company now. So what do you mean by we?
I do that. It's from having done a PhD. You just you spend a couple of years saying we for whatever you do, even though it's just you. But I did hire another engineer recently. Stashu Korik started in January or so, I think, and has been working on the F# rewrite with me.
I thought you also have contributors from outside too, because you're running everything open source, right?
So it's not quite open source. It's source available, but it isn't, the four freedoms kind of vibe. But we had contributors. So when we open source, when we opened up the repo in 2020, this was sort of early 2020 before the company restructuring. The intent was to allow contributors to solve the problems that they were having with Dark. And partially, the main thing it did is that by allowing them solve the problems, it allowed us not commit to solving their problems, which was it's a different way of looking at the same thing. But we had 20 contributors at the start, and basically I was pinging people every 3 days. I had a spreadsheet of contributors. Anyone who'd said, oh, this looks interesting, I was sending the message, how's it going? Anything I can help with? Can we pair? And I was able to sort of push to get those contributions out, but it didn't stay organic. And I was running a sales process for contributions instead of having this organic marketing process for it, or product-led growth, or whatever they call for it. And so when I stopped doing it, it fell off. And then when I started rewriting it, it became clear that rewriting is not a good time to have contributors or try to bring them on, because in such a state of flux, huge portions of it were changing. Now that the rewrite is almost done, it's a much better time for it.
Well, this is kind of leading into a little bit of the meat of why I asked you to come on. Okay, so you wrote the system. Maybe we could talk about the V1. What was V1 written in and why?
V1 was actually Python. In V0, I built a thing in 2 weeks, basically to demo that I thought this thing was possible and that I could build a blog in this simple idea. 800 lines of Python, and the front end was about 800 lines of Elm. And as soon as I was done demoing this, I was like, I cannot possibly rewrite this. I cannot possibly continue to make significant product changes in this untyped language. And so at that point, I rewrote it in OCaml. This is 2017. And it was in OCaml, I mean, still in OCaml until, if you made a HTTP request to Dark until yesterday, it was OCaml that was at the other end of that web server.
Why'd you pick OCaml? I mean, OCaml really is quite a niche language. I mean, I think a few companies are using that. And I think the biggest one I can think of is probably Jane Street in finance.
Facebook does significant stuff in it as well. But yeah, those are kind of the only two I can really think of. I think there's a bunch of crypto people doing stuff as well. But I picked OCaml because I had just done a lot of experimenting with Haskell and came to the conclusion that Haskell was not where I wanted to hitch my wagon. And so I hadn't actually used OCaml. I really liked Elm. And OCaml seemed to be the server-side language, the server-side equivalent of it. And so I figured I'll just give it a shot. If I don't like it, I can give it up. And, kind of 6 months later, I was like, actually, this thing is I really like it.
Yeah, I've heard good things about it, but I haven't tried it yet. And I'm happy that you use Elm because I'm also a big fan of Elm. Just like,
I mean, if you like Elm, you'll like OCaml. Yeah. They're almost the same. And Dark, again, almost the same language.
Yeah. Well, my favorite part is like the union types. I really love that. Are you guys still using Elm in the front end?
No, so we did a rewrite of the front end. We rewrote it into Rescript, which is front-end OCaml. And we had hoped to do a whole lot of using the same types and using the same code. That actually never happened. The languages have since diverged even further.
Okay, so this V1, so basically V0, your kind of prototype is written in Python. I'm a little bit surprising, but I guess it's easy to whip up something in Python. It's a scripting language.
Yeah.
Then OCaml was the next one. It's interesting because Rust's initial compiler, I think, was written in OCaml. So it's definitely powerful.
I have a funny story about that. My first day at Mozilla, Graydon, who wrote Rust, gave his announcement of Rust to the world. And I was like, I work in OCaml or in compilers. This is great. I'm going to work on this Rust thing. And so I talked to Graydon about it. And he was like, yeah, great. Here's some stuff to do. I was just looking at this OCaml thing. And I was like, I don't understand any of this. I don't know how this compiler works. And so I went and, worked in C++ instead on Firefox.
Wow, that's kind of a weird story. It's kind of, I don't know, I guess now Rust is coming back to you, right?
Right, exactly, yeah. And, I didn't know OCaml, and now everything's in OCaml. It's kind of a fun. I'm writing my own OCaml almost.
Okay, it's pretty interesting. Yeah, it's funny, and then you go back to OCaml. Okay, but everything's working fine for you with OCaml, right? So what prompted the rewrite? Is it just boredom? Or I do know the answer, kind of.
Yeah. So we had done a bunch of things badly. I say badly, I don't mean it to sound like... What I mean is that we had made, decisions to cut scope and to do things quickly. And where we had ended up is that we had almost everything running in our database. So we had queues running in our database, we had cron running in our database, we had stuff which should be stored in S3 running in our database. And the reason we had them there is because we didn't have client libraries we didn't have SDKs because we were using OCaml. And there wasn't SDKs for all the things that we wanted to do. And also we hadn't used async, and that was our fault. But we didn't understand how to use async when it came out. And so at that time, I was like, well, I'm going to keep committing to writing this thing where there's no libraries for anything, or where there's very few libraries for SDKs, or am I going to switch to something else? And if I'm not going to switch to something else, well, I better decide that I am going to stay in OCaml, and then, attempt to fix some of these things, rewrite the current version in async, that sort of thing. And I needed to make one of those decisions. And I figured that making that decision, now being 2020, was a better decision than waiting, 5 or 10 years. If it was going to be a small company, we should get the speed of iteration up. And that's more important than doing more stuff now.
Okay, so what were the contenders for the next rewrite?
At the time, you mean?
Yeah, definitely. At the time.
I would say the only real contenders were Rust and F#. And, I really thought the only contender was Rust. We'd been talking about the Rust rewrite for years. We almost paid someone to actually start the Rust rewrite. So we were fairly sure that it was going to be in Rust. And Rust has the things that we need: the async, the immutable collections, pattern matching, all the things that make writing a compiler/interpreter good. And it also has the really powerful web servers, because of course we're writing APIs and web servers and all that sort of thing as well. So, really Rust was the only contender. And it wasn't until I started playing with Rust and really trying out what it would take to write Dark in Rust that I found it to be so difficult as to look at other things. And I mean, when I list out the other things that I might look at, there's F#, that was a maybe. And there's Go. I don't think Go is where I really want to go with this. And so it was really like, all right, Rust isn't working for me. Let's see how F# works out. And thank God F# worked out, because otherwise I would probably still be writing OCaml, unhappy about it.
This is interesting, right? Because like I said, the main reason I want to bring you on here because I do remember reading some of the blog posts and I was like, okay, this is definitely going to be Rust too. Like that's what I was seeing inside. That's what I was hoping for.
I was sure it was going to be Rust as well. Like I would have bet a lot of money that it was going to be Rust. But I don't think Rust was a good match for what we were trying to do. Certainly, if I was, thinking back to writing Firefox or writing the games that we wrote or any kind of the low-level stuff that I've done back in the day, I think Rust would be a wonderful match for that, but it not really for what Dark is and was at the time.
Can you go a little bit more in depth? Because like I hear a lot of days people are doing higher level things with Rust, not just the lower level, right? So it's hard for me to still imagine, okay, everything is falling into place, everything you're saying makes sense, but then like I'm not quite understanding why is it that it doesn't fit this use case? I mean, people are definitely building languages on top of Rust.
Yeah. So I think the main thing is that with Rust, you pay a lot in terms of the programming effort and you get paid, you get your reward in performance. And the performance needs are just not that severe for me. But the writing it quickly is very important. And I'll sort of jump to the end and we can discuss all the things that led to this. But the conclusion is that in Rust, the lack of garbage collector, I know it has compile time garbage collection. Well, yeah. There isn't a moving, copying, whatever it is, garbage collector, mark and sweep sort of thing. And that actually gets you so much performance. I mean, performance in the productivity. It gets you so much productivity. And all of the things that I like about OCaml, about F# can be attributed to the fact that it is garbage collected. And so when I was trying to do Rust, I was trying to write OCaml in Rust. And Rust is not a good OCaml. Rust is it's a good Rust, but it's not a good OCaml, Haskell. It's not a good functional language.
Yeah, Rust is kind of a little bit of a strange language in terms of there's some functional aspects to it for sure.
It tricked me.
But yeah.
I thought I was right. It had pattern matching. It has map-looking things. I thought I was going to be writing functional programming.
Yeah, it's definitely some kind of mutation in between. I don't know how to even call it that.
I mean, I think it's an imperative language, and it's just sort of hiding behind a functional-ish veneer. Like the expression-oriented nature of it. Yeah, this is totally a functional language. Look, it's got expressions for everything. It's like, well, no. Pattern matching, that's a functional language. No.
I think it's kind of interesting because you'd figure if you wanted to run something like Dark that you'd want as much performance as you can because you want to be able to kind of save some. I mean, you're running multiple applications. You want to make sure it's quick. You probably actually want to design a garbage collector for people's apps. I don't know how exactly Dark language works, but that's what I usually think about. Like, It seems like most of these kind of languages that I can compare to Dark in terms of, even like the hot code reloading or something that you can have Dark deploying so quickly.
No, we have an interpreter.
Okay, so that's all interpreted.
Yeah, it's interpreted. It's 500 lines of interpreter, and that's it. And Dark does not need to be Rust fast, right? The kind of programs that you're writing in Dark, certainly today, and I have a plan for the future, but certainly today, the kind of things that you're running, run in a millisecond. And then it takes 4 milliseconds to load the program from the database. And then it takes 50 milliseconds to reach the server. So, moving 1 millisecond of execution time, or even, if it's 50 milliseconds of execution time, we don't get a whole lot out of getting that performance down because probably most of that 50 milliseconds is database anyway. And so the performance doesn't buy us what it costs us.
Okay, that's pretty interesting. And I find it really interesting that F#, a language that has a garbage collector, is what makes more sense to you.
Yeah, because I don't have to write a garbage collector. I just use, and you were talking about some types earlier, use some types heavily. It makes writing a programming languages are perfect for some types and enums and whatever, and they're perfect for like functional languages. And when you're writing an immutable functional language, the best thing to write it in is an immutable functional language, unless you really need that performance, which I don't. What I really need is to be able to write stuff quickly so that I can build the startup.
Yeah, that's interesting. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, everybody, you need to go fast when you have a startup, right?
Right.
I also find it very interesting that you decided to choose F# because it's kind of branded as like a Microsoft-y thing, right? So it's like, wow, that doesn't really make sense. But I know that within the last few years, they opened up, right?
Yeah, it has completely changed. And the .NET We're now in .NET 6, but .NET 5 felt like, I didn't know this when I was trying it out, but it felt like I couldn't have done this in anything less than .NET 5. And certainly couldn't have used F# in whatever state it was in 2017. They have rewritten .NET entirely, this thing called .NET Core. And it's open source and all that, but it also like gets rid of a lot of the baggage that they had with the old version of .NET, which was called .NET Framework. And so .NET 5, 6, whatever it is phenomenal. It's, incredible performance, great libraries, very well designed, very minimal baggage. The only real baggage, I think, is the build system, and the build system is bad. But, in Rust's compiler is also slow, so, both options I had really had a slow compiler.
Yeah, I've been working a little bit with Blazor just to kind of get it, to try something new, and I was a little bit annoyed, to be honest.
Yes.
There's no hot code reloading, like in terms of like if I make an edit to the HTML or the Razor page, how come if I save it doesn't get automatically refreshed? I have to actually rebuild it, which annoys the hell out of me.
Yeah, it's funny because the IDE, refreshes very quickly, and the tooling and the language server. And so like the compiler can run quickly, but I make a change and it takes 30 seconds to rebuild. And I don't know, that's ridiculous in this day and age.
Yeah, definitely. But I mean, okay, so F#, I think if I had to write something in .NET, I think I'd rather choose F# because like,
yeah.
As you know already, like I'm a fan of Elm. F# is very similar when you look at the two. I think maybe you can nearly copy paste and change a couple of things and you're nearly there.
I think I'm at the point in my life where I don't understand how people can write imperative languages anymore. Like, it's just, I've been writing functional languages, like CircleCI was written in Clojure. So I'm like 10, 11 years of just like almost entirely writing functional languages. And it's kind of hard to like, once you bend your brain to think that way, it's kind of hard to think in imperative languages again.
Yeah, that's true. And also the idea of, I don't know, like when I write Elixir programs, which I'm doing more than Rust programs these days, like to explain to somebody, because people want to know, where's the entry point? Where does the first line start? Well, how do you say that? Because anything can happen at any time. This is a concurrent system. And I think F# is probably pretty similar to that. It's like, well, this function could get called or that can get called. You don't really know, right?
There is like an entry point annotation, but Dark actually has a similar thing. Like it doesn't have a main thing. It just has a bunch of handlers, and the handlers just live. And there isn't like a place that the web server starts and that you add your startup code or something like that. It's just sort of, it's all live all the time in the cloud. It's a different way of thinking about things.
Definitely takes people's minds a little bit of a drift to understand what's going on when you have this kind of style. I want to go a little bit more back to Rust, right? So you did quite a few blog posts before you really made a choice, right? I think it was like 3, 4, 5 of these or something.
There was a series of 3 where I talked about, Dark is doing a rewrite, and Dark is leaving OCaml, Dark is rewriting in F#, and then Dark is, why Dark didn't choose Rust. But before that, there was also a little bit talking about like programming in async and how I wasn't having a great time with that. And there was one on like, my first view of Rust. And I was comparing Rust against OCaml because I figured that would do well on Hacker News.
Well, when you mean do well, you mean get trolled, right? Because I think that's what you told me before the show.
Absolutely, yeah. Because certainly anything that's on Hacker News, people hate with a passion. But, it also gets you users. And so it is an essential tool for content marketing.
Well, isn't it like any news is good news kind of thing where it's like even if people hate on you for your opinions, it's good for you overall.
We wrote this blog post about deploy lists. It was called How Dark Deploys in 50 Milliseconds. And deploy list is like this idea of you're writing in production. And I can't remember the name of the community, but my friend is in this community of like embittered sysadmins, and they just hated it. And they went to town on it. I finally like figured out how to get into the community, and I read it, and it was like, I love that stuff. I love we hate what you're doing, because it helps you understand like how they don't get it or how they don't understand or who not to talk to. But also because like people who are shitting on things can be very funny. Even if it's your thing, it's like, often those cutting remarks are hilarious.
Well, would you like to address some of the common replies that people gave to you about the rewrite and why you chose F#?
So the rewrite, let's see. There's the standard, you didn't give Rust a fair shot. You're not smart enough to write Rust. You don't know anything about programming languages or low-level languages. Let's just ignore the amount of time I spent on the years I spent in C++. I think there's some shitting on the rewrite, on the idea of doing a rewrite. You should never do a rewrite, the old Joel Spolsky blog post. And, in retrospect, some solid points there. But I think people were quite nice about the whole thing. Maybe I'm just misremembering.
Yeah, okay. Because I know, like you said, okay, you don't know what you're doing, and your reply as well. Actually, kind of, I know what I'm doing because I got a PhD in this subject area, and I was around when Rust was there, and I saw it way before you did. So I don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah. Yes, I mean, certainly the sort of like idea of I have no idea of what I'm doing is, it's in the eye of the beholder or whatever. But certainly, don't know C or don't know C++ is probably not the right place to come at me.
I think that I do have one, you can let me know if this is valid or not, but I think it's quite valid, obviously, is you can't kind of compare one language to another when they have kind of different paradigms, right? So if you're trying to write OCaml and Rust, it's like, doesn't really make sense.
Yeah.
You need to kind of change your mindset. That's my kind of feedback. Well, maybe you had the wrong mindset going in, that you're expecting this, and it's just not the way it is.
I think that's completely fair. I think I was trying to write, OCaml, because that is actually what I wanted to write. Part of the criteria was that it was important that be able to write things quickly. It was important that, for example, that we didn't have to write our own garbage collector for dark programs. And so I really did want OCaml. And when I was coming to Rust, I thought that's what I was getting. I thought I was getting like a better, faster, something borrower checker version of OCaml. And so I think I really was, writing in the wrong paradigm for Rust. And I think it's just that the paradigm that I wanted was not the paradigm that Rust offered. And that's basically why I ended up in F#, because the paradigm over at F# was what I wanted.
And not to mention, you also wanted the productivity gains of having a language that's not only fast, but also productive to write in. Now I need to kind of deal with the borrow checker and the nuances of the program, etc., right?
Yeah. This maybe wasn't the exact right way of thinking about it, but I wanted to continue writing a recursive descent interpreter. And I didn't want to have to rewrite it for performance or anything like that. The goal was that when it is time to do performance, we will write a compiler. And until then, the interpreter had better suffice. So with Rust, I don't remember the exact details of this, but I remember there was a problem with like async plus pinning plus recursion. Maybe just didn't work all that well. I forget whether it was async and recursion or pinning and async, or I don't remember the exact thing. But I was actually thinking maybe, doing this recursive thing is actually like part of the problem. And maybe I should now take the time to rewrite this in a more sort of, virtual machine-based interpreter with bytecode and that sort of thing, and not just be like an AST walking interpreter. And I was like, no, that's exactly the opposite of what I'm doing. I want to have my programming productivity, and I want to not spend time on things that don't bring a whole lot of value at this stage.
Okay, it's pretty valid.
It's not to say that, the next version isn't going to be written in Rust. There might be another version in 10 years where we do really need the 10x productivity, or performance. I don't know what the performance difference would be, but it is possible that we might need that in the future. And, it's always possible that we will do, a small amount in Rust in the future.
What I did find quite interesting is that you do have a roadmap, so roadmap.dartlang.com. And I don't know what this is written in, but it looks a lot like Rust documentation. Is this some kind of similar?
Oh, that's funny. So roadmap is actually the old roadmap. The roadmap is now being done in a GitHub issue. If you go to our GitHub issues page, there's a pinned issue, which is the roadmap. But I know what you're talking about, roadmap.dartlang.com. What is that? I think it might be the same thing that Rust docs are written in. I think I had a big markdown thing and I switched to that at some point.
Yeah, and you also have
should be able to
another weird thing I found too is that you have a Rust format.toml file in your project.
Yeah, because we have Rust. So we have two things in Rust. So one is a queue scheduler in the database. So we have our queue runs in our database, which is a bad thing, and will be removed. But that is one project that we have. And then the other, I mentioned that we didn't do async in OCaml. And so we needed something to be able to send exceptions and something else, send exceptions and other like analytic stuff in the runtime. without like hanging on the third-party services that we use for them. So we wrote this thing called Stroller, which is basically a proxy, and it just like accepts a HTTP request and then disconnects, and it will send it on its own time.
Okay, I didn't even know you guys are using Rust. That's pretty interesting.
Two Rust things. There's also some Go in there. There's obviously F#. There's a couple of Python files. Our build stuff is Python. There's a whole lot of Bash. Mountains of YAML. Who can do anything without YAML these days? And of course, Rescript. I think that's probably all the languages we've got in there.
Still quite a conglomerate of different languages, so you can't say you guys are only F# or only OCaml.
Right. Well, I'm hoping that we will be able to remove Rust and OCaml soon. It takes a significant amount of our deploy time to build all the different stuff. And so just removing two languages from our thing will make our deploys like twice as fast.
Yeah, definitely, especially the rebuilding the Rust stuff. Everybody's aware of the slow build time in Rust, but they try to let that go with the huge performance gains in runtime. We
have a dev container as well, and so just having all the Rust tooling on there just adds a lot to sort of the weight of that.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, is there anything you want us to know about Dark other than, of course, come check it out? And
I mean, you should definitely come check it out. Darklang.com, you can create an account and edit it there. I guess the main thing that I would say is to lower your expectations. I would think of Dark in the present day as a project that is doing some cool stuff, as opposed to the place where you are going to write all of your things. So it's useful for, writing small things, Slack bots, things that take a webhook and do something to it. But it's not yet at the point that it's going to replace, everything. And so don't approach it with that expectation. I think Dark is something that will take, many years to get to a place where it is phenomenal. So, in the same way that Rust did. Rust is 15 years old now. I know it was released in 2010, but it was 4 years old at that point already, 2011. So Dark has a couple of interesting ideas that I would really like other people to steal. So there's this idea of trace-driven development where you make a HTTP request, maybe from your client or whatever, and then you have that trace alongside your code as you write it. So anytime that you access a variable or do some computation or anything, you see the actual result next to you of the actual request that you made a minute ago. And it completely changes how you program. It is so beneficial and so much better than what everyone else is doing that I'm shocked that no one has tried to connect their production to Visual Studio Code or something like that to try and get there.
Yeah, that does sound pretty cool. I do like the video that the previous CEO put up where she built a Slack bot pretty quickly. That's quite interesting.
Yeah, I think in 10 minutes did, storing in a database, the infrastructure, obviously, the HTTP requests. We had the clients pre-built, but after that, nothing else was pre-done. So there's anything that you do in a project, even you see other people doing this and they have their databases pre-set up, they have their IAM keys pre-set up, they have their serverless configs pre-set up, and there's none of that in the demo. It's just, it starts from nothing apart from you logged in. And I think it is pretty cool. I think that's kind of ultimately, the thing with Dark is that we succeeded at proving out our first two concepts, that you could build programs without this sort of low level, we're running this thing in a virtual machine on a computer with a compiler and a tool chain kind of idea. And also this 0-second deploy idea. And I think when we started, everyone said, this can't be done. It isn't possible to do this. And I said, no, I have an idea of how it's going to be done. And so we proved out that that was possible. And now all that we have to do is all the other stuff that every language has done, the package manager, the SDKs for all the things, the libraries, the full type system, etc. Easy stuff that has been done before.
Yeah, you guys definitely succeeded. I'm just quite surprised. But has there been an uptick in people using it yet, or kind of what's the users about?
No, it has actually stayed fairly steady for the last year. 3 or 4 people trying it out a day, which is really very small in sort of adoption terms. I think Dark is still hard to adopt, and also the story that we tell on our website is terrible. We're still telling the story of Dark is the best way to build an API. And objectively, Dark is not the best way to build an API. Dark will some day be the best way to build an API. But right now, Dark is an interesting project that you might find it fun to build some small things in. And so people sign on expecting it to be the best way to build an API. And they quickly learn that it is not. So I think I've been putting off the rewrite the homepage, the rewrite the positioning, rewrite how we talk about it until the rewrite is done. And oh my God, it's so close. It's so close to done, but it is not yet done. So.
Okay. So I think we covered our topic pretty well. Is there anything else you wanted to say before we start to sign off?
I'm all good. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Rust is a delightful language and a delightful community, and I really don't hate it.
People may think that you don't like it because you didn't choose it, though, but I'm glad you made it quite clear that it's just not a good fit for you for this time for this project.
Yeah.
Maybe we can make people in the audience happy, right? So which one would you rather choose, C or C++ or Rust to write?
Oh, Rust any day of the week. I would never write C++ again.
All right. You made me happy. Thank you for your time. I really appreciate it. So guys, check out, go to darklang.com, sign up and give it a shot and see what you feel. And, know that this is written in F# and don't bash F# like me or .NET. Things have gone a long way since a few years ago.
And if you fancy contributing to a fancy programming language that's not written in Rust, unfortunately, our GitHub is wide open.
Thank you for your time. I really appreciate it. Maybe we'll catch up again. Maybe when you decide, F# not right for us anymore, we got to do something else.
I'm sure that day will come.
Okay. Thank you.